The Egyptian coast is still in the early morning hours of late September, 48 BC. The air smells of salt and river mud. A small fishing boat rocks on the gentle swells off the shore of Pelusium. At the mouth of the Nile Delta, and aboard a larger vessel anchored nearby, a man stands at the railing. Watching that boat approach, he is 57 years old. His hair is thinning. His face carries the deep lines of a man who has spent decades in the field, in the sun, in the wind. But there is still something commanding about the way he holds himself. Something that makes the soldiers around him stand a little straighter, without quite knowing why. His name is Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. The Romans called him Pompey the Great. And right now, he is the most hunted man in the known world. 3 weeks ago, on the plains of Pharsalus in central Greece, the largest Roman army ever assembled on a single field met Julius Caesar's veterans in open battle. Pompey had more men, more cavalry, more supplies, and the full legitimacy of the Roman Senate behind him. He had every advantage that a general could want. And in the space of a single afternoon, it was gone. His army broke. His camp was overrun. And Pompey himself rode away from the battlefield in silence, changed into plain clothes, and disappeared into the dust. Now he is here, off the coast of Egypt, with a handful of ships and a desperate plan. The young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII owes everything to Rome, and, specifically, to Pompey, whose political influence helped restore Ptolemy father to the throne. Surely Egypt will help. Surely there is still a path forward. The fishing boat draws closer. 2 men are standing in it. Pompey recognizes one of them immediately. Lucius Septimius, a Roman officer, a soldier who once served under Pompey's own command during the campaigns in the East, more than a decade ago. A familiar face. A reassuring face. Pompey turns to his wife, Cornelia. She is watching from the deck, with an expression he has learned to read over the years. She is frightened. His advisors are telling him not to go. The boat is too small. The welcome is too quiet. Something feels wrong. Pompey studies Septimius across the water. Then he says, almost to himself, that it is beneath the dignity of a man of his position to show fear. He steps down into the boat. What follows takes less than 5 minutes. According to Plutarch, as Pompey prepared to step ashore, he turned to read from a small Greek text he had brought, rehearsing a speech he planned to give to the young pharaoh. He never finished it. Septimius drives a sword into his back. A centurion named Salvius draws his blade. Then the Egyptian general Achilles joins them. Cornelia screams from the larger ship. Pompey's son raises a battle cry. But there is nothing to be done. Plutarch records the final moment with extraordinary precision. Pompey drew his toga over his face with both hands, and neither saying nor doing anything unworthy of himself, endured the blows. He was 59 years old. It was the day after his birthday. The man who had once told the Roman Senate that he could raise armies simply by stamping his foot on Italian soil, dies in a rowboat, stabbed in the back by a man he once trusted. His head is severed. His signet ring, engraved with a lion holding a sword, is removed from his finger. 3 days later, Julius Caesar arrives at Alexandria. The Egyptians present him with a carefully wrapped gift. When it is opened, Caesar turns away without looking. Then, according to Plutarch, he takes the signet ring, and he weeps. Whether those tears were real or the most brilliantly timed performance of his life, no one in that room could say. Perhaps Caesar himself could not say. But here is what we know for certain. The greatest rivalry in Roman history ended not in a blaze of glory. Not on a field of honor, but with a head in a box and a man who could not bring himself to look at it. And to understand how it came to this, we have to go back to when these 2 men were not enemies. Back to when Rome needed both of them. And they needed each other, and the idea of one destroying the other would have seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. Rome, 60 BC. The city smells of smoke and ambition and old money. The forum is crowded from sunrise to sunset with men in togas arguing about grain prices, provincial appointments, and who owes whom a political favor. The Senate, founded 4 centuries ago to govern a single city on the banks of the Tiber, is now nominally ruling an empire that stretches from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the mountains of Armenia. It is groaning under its own weight, and everyone who matters knows it. In this city, in this moment, there are 2 men whose names are on every lip, and whose ambitions are making every senator nervous. The first is Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. He is 46 years old, broad-shouldered, handsome in a slightly heavy-jawed way. And he carries himself with the absolute physical certainty of a man who has never doubted his own greatness, because he has never been given reason to. The Romans began calling him Magnus, the Great, when he was 23 years old, and it stuck because nothing that happened afterward gave anyone reason to take it back. His record is staggering. At 35, he cleared the entire Mediterranean of pirates in 3 months flat, a job that the Senate had told him would take 3 years. He did not do it slowly or carefully. He divided the sea into 13 districts, deployed his forces simultaneously across all of them, and swept the pirates into a corner from which there was no escape. When it was done, Rome's grain supply was secure for the first time in a generation. Then he went east. He reorganized the entire eastern Mediterranean, created new provinces, settled the affairs of a dozen kingdoms, and brought home so much treasure that his triumph in 61 BC lasted 2 days. The streets of Rome were lined with paintings showing the lands he had conquered. Behind him marched 324 captured chieftains and princes. The Senate awarded him the extraordinary honor of wearing his triumphal garb at all public games for the rest of his life. Then he disbanded his army, just like that. He sent his veterans home and walked into Rome as a private citizen. Because that was what Roman law required, and Pompey, whatever his faults, believed in Roman law. And the Senate refused to ratify his eastern settlements. The conservative senators, led by men like Lucullus and the famously incorruptible Cato, had been afraid of Pompey for years. A general with that much prestige, that much money, that many loyal veterans was a threat to the Republic, whether he intended to be one or not. So they simply refused to give him what he had earned, blocking the land grants for his veterans. Rejected his reorganization of the East. Sent him home with nothing. Pompey was humiliated. The greatest general alive, rendered politically impotent by small men with veto power and old grudges. He had the loyalty of 10,000 soldiers and nowhere to put it. The second man making Rome nervous is Gaius Julius Caesar. He is 40 years old. He is not as obviously imposing as Pompey. He is lean rather than broad. And he has the kind of face that you notice more the longer you look at it, a face of extraordinary intelligence held in careful control. He speaks beautifully. He writes beautifully. He gambles, drinks, has affairs with other men's wives in numbers that would be scandalous if he were not so cheerfully unapologetic about it. And he owes money to essentially everyone in Rome. His family is ancient, patrician, and nearly broke. The Julii claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, which gave Caesar exactly the kind of mythological ego that requires very large military victories to sustain. He had been a quaestor, an aedile, a praetor, and a governor of Spain, where he had won some military successes and immediately spent all the resulting money on games for the Roman public. The people loved him. The Senate's conservative faction hated him. And his creditors were beginning to make threatening noises. What Caesar needed, desperately, was a long military command. Without one, he would remain what he was, a brilliantly talented politician with a famous name. a mountain of debt, and no path to the kind of legacy that the son of Venus required. Into this situation walks Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Possibly the richest man in the world. He had made his fortune in real estate, silver mines, and the kind of creative financial maneuvering that Romans of the period called investment and moderns might call something else entirely. He had crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus in 71 BC, crucifying 6,000 of the rebels along the Appian Way as a warning to anyone who had similar ideas. He had his own Senate enemies. He had his own frustrated ambitions. And he had come to understand, through decades of experience, that money alone, without political protection, was fragile. Sometime in late 60 BC, these three men, separately and through intermediaries and then, reportedly, in person at a meeting whose details no ancient source records with confidence, make an arrangement. There is no contract. There is no ceremony. There is no official title. Later historians will call it the first triumvirate, the rule of three, though contemporary Romans had no such term for it. What it is, at its heart, is a cold-blooded bargain between men who understand each other completely and trust each other not at all. Pompey has military glory and the loyalty of his veterans. Caesar has the love of the Roman people and a political genius that borders on the supernatural. Crassus has the money. Together, they can dominate the Senate. Separately, the Senate can destroy each of them, one by one, at leisure. To seal the arrangement, Caesar offers Pompey the thing that no political transaction can quite match: a human bond. He gives Pompey his daughter, Julia. She is approximately 20 years old. Pompey is 47. The age difference is not unusual by Roman standards, but what is unusual, and what every ancient source comments on, is what happens next. The marriage, arranged entirely as political cement, becomes something neither man planned for. They fall in love. Plutarch notes it. Suetonius notes it. Every source that mentions Julia mentions that Pompey was genuinely devoted to her, that he neglected public business to be with her, that the crowds who saw them together found it touching rather than ridiculous. For a man who had spent his entire adult life performing strength and authority, Pompey's transparent adoration of his young wife was perhaps the most human thing about him. And for Caesar, watching from Gaul where he would soon be headed with his new command, it was also a political masterstroke. As long as Pompey loved Julia, Caesar had a connection to Pompey that went deeper than any treaty. The triumvirate works. Caesar is elected consul for 59 BC and immediately begins pushing through legislation that would have been impossible a year earlier: land grants for Pompey's veterans, ratification of his eastern settlements, and, for himself, a 5-year command in Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. The Senate fumes that the conservative consul Bibulus tries to obstruct everything through religious technicalities. Eventually gives up, goes home, and stays there for the rest of the year. Caesar runs Rome alone. Then, in the spring of 58 BC, he heads north for Gaul. And the story of how one alliance between three ambitious men changed the course of Western civilization begins in earnest. What none of them know, sitting in their satisfaction in 59 BC, is that the arrangement they have made rests on two foundations that are far more fragile than they appear: one old man's greed, and one young woman's life. When either one gives way, everything will fall. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when the man holding everything together suddenly isn't there anymore. The chairs don't move. The walls don't change. But the air itself feels different, and everyone in the room knows, without anyone having to say it, that the rules have just changed. That is what happened to Rome in 53 BC. And it did not happen in Rome at all. It happened in the desert, on a flat and merciless plain near the Mesopotamian city of Carrhae. Where the richest man in the world walked into a battle he was never going to win, and the three-legged stool that had been holding the Republic together lost its third leg. Marcus Licinius Crassus had spent his entire life watching other men receive the glory he believed he deserved. He had crushed Spartacus. He had fought his way to the consulship twice. He had financed Caesar's early career, propped up Pompey's political ambitions, and bankrolled half the Senate. And still, when Romans told stories around their dinner tables, it was always Caesar and Pompey they talked about. Crassus was the man who paid for things. A great man, certainly. But not the kind of great man who gets a triumph celebrated in his honor. In 55 BC, he was appointed governor of Syria. And with Syria came an opportunity. The Parthian Empire lay just across the Euphrates, rich and, in Crassus's estimation, poorly defended. He had watched Caesar conquer Gaul. He had watched Pompey organize the entire eastern Mediterranean. He was 60 years old and running out of time to add his own chapter to Roman legend. He told anyone who would listen that he would outshine both of his partners. He would conquer Parthia. He would press on to Bactria, to India, all the way to the outer sea. Plutarch records that when Crassus departed Rome for Syria in the late winter of 54 BC, an angry crowd tried to block his passage through the city gates. A tribune named Ateus stood at the gate with a lit brazier and hurled formal curses at Crassus as he passed. Formal, ritualized, ugly curses. The kind that Romans took seriously. Crassus rode through them anyway. He should have listened. In the spring of 53 BC, he crossed the Euphrates into Parthian territory with 7 legions, approximately 43,000 soldiers, supported by cavalry and light infantry. His Armenian ally, the king Artavastus II, urged him to enter Parthia through the northern highlands of Armenia, where the terrain would neutralize the Parthian cavalry. Crassus refused. He preferred the open plains of Mesopotamia, the faster route, the more direct path to glory. The Parthian commander facing him was a man named Serena. He was perhaps 30 years old. He was commanding a force that Crassus's scouts assessed as far smaller than the Roman army. What the scouts did not fully communicate, because perhaps they did not fully understand it themselves, was that the Parthian army was almost entirely cavalry. And that it fought in a way that no Roman legion had been designed to counter. On the morning of June 9, 53 BC, near the town of Carrhae, the two forces met. The Parthians let their cataphract cavalry approach, hidden under cloaks, and then at a signal, the cloaks fell away, and the drums began to beat. Suddenly, the Roman front line was looking at armored horsemen and 10,000 mounted archers and a sound that Plutarch describes as a deep and terrifying roar, like thunder mixed with the screaming of animals. The Roman legions formed their defensive squares. The Parthian horse archers rode around them, just out of reach, and did not stop shooting. The Romans waited for the archers to run out of arrows. They didn't. Serena had brought a supply train of 1,000 camels, each one loaded with arrows. There was no end to it. Crassus's son Publius led a cavalry charge to break the encirclement. The Parthians pulled back as if retreating, then surrounded him. Publius was killed. His head was mounted on a lance and paraded in front of his father's lines. What happened to Crassus after that is recorded in fragments by Plutarch and Cassius Dio, and neither account is the same. What is certain is this: he retreated to the city of Carrhae with the remnants of his army. He attempted to negotiate with Serena. The negotiation was a trap. On the 11th or 12th of May, historians still debate the exact date. But Crassus was killed in the resulting scuffle, either by his own men to prevent his capture or by the Parthians themselves. His head was severed and sent to the Parthian king Orodes II. Cassius Dio records that the Parthians, in mockery of his legendary greed, poured molten gold into his open mouth. Whether this actually happened, or whether it was a story the Romans told themselves afterward. Because it felt like the right kind of ending for a man who had spent his life chasing wealth, we cannot say with certainty. But the image survived, and it tells you something about what the Romans thought of Crassus's life. 20,000 Roman soldiers were dead. Another 10,000 were taken prisoner and marched east, never to return. The 7 legionary standards, those sacred symbols of Roman military honor, were lost to a foreign enemy and were not recovered for 30 years, when the first emperor, Augustus, finally negotiated their return through diplomacy rather than force. Back in Rome, when the news arrived, the city felt it like a physical blow. And in the quieter rooms, among the men who thought about power rather than just grieving it, there was a calculation being made. The triangle was now a line. And a line has 2 ends. Only 1 year later, in the early autumn of 54 BC, the second support holding the triumvirate together broke. And this time, the loss was not a disaster. It was a death. A young woman's death, and the death of her child, and the death of something in Pompey that had never before been touched. Julia had been showing signs of a difficult pregnancy throughout the summer. Pompey had already watched her miscarry once, the previous year, when a slave brought his blood-stained toga home from a riot in the Forum, and Julia, seeing it and believing him dead, had collapsed in premature labor. She had survived that. She had grown stronger, or so it seemed. The doctors were hopeful. In September of 54 BC, she went into labor for the second time. Plutarch records the outcome in a single sentence that somehow contains everything: she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. But she died in the process of giving birth, and the child only survived her for a few days. Caesar was in Britain when the news reached him. The sources tell us he was grief-stricken. The sources also tell us he was a man who had always been able to keep moving through grief, because there was always something that needed doing next. He kept moving. Pompey did not keep moving. Not right away. He had been, by every account that survives, genuinely transformed by his marriage to Julia. Plutarch writes that Pompey spent all his time with his wife, going about Italy from one pleasure resort to another. Whether because he was so deeply in love with her, or because she was so much in love with him that he could not bear to leave her. This was not how Pompey the Great was supposed to behave. This was not the man who had swept the Mediterranean clean of pirates, who had marched his armies from Spain to the Black Sea, who had reorganized the entire East with the efficiency of a man sorting correspondence. This was a man who had, somewhere in the 5 years of his marriage to a young woman 30 years his junior, allowed himself to be simply and thoroughly in love. He wanted to bury her at his country house near Alba. The Roman people would not allow it. They descended on the Forum in numbers that shocked even the tribunes who opposed the burial. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, one of the consuls and a man whose hatred for both Caesar and Pompey was a matter of public record, tried to block the funeral by legal means. The crowd ignored him. Julia was carried through the Forum, a funeral oration was delivered, and she was buried in the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, the great plain outside the city walls, where Roman heroes rested. Plutarch says both Caesar and Pompey were deeply affected by her death. That is the measured language of ancient biography. What it cannot quite contain is this: the human thread connecting the 2 most powerful men in the Roman world had just been cut. The political logic of the triumvirate had rested, in its final years, almost entirely on the fact that Pompey loved his wife and his wife was Caesar's daughter. Now there was no wife. Now there was no daughter. Now there were just 2 men with armies and ambitions and no more reason to trust each other. Pompey remarried in the months that followed. His new wife was Cornelia, daughter of Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius Scipio Nasica. a man of impeccable aristocratic credentials and deep ties to the conservative Senate faction that despised Caesar. The Optimates who had blocked Julius' burial. The men who had spent a decade trying to break the triumvirate. He did not choose this marriage out of hostility to Caesar. He chose it because he was a man who had always needed to belong somewhere, and now the place where he had belonged for 5 years was gone. But the marriage was still a signal, whether he intended it as one or not. And Caesar, reading the news from Britain, read it. The die had not yet been cast. But someone had picked it up. There is a river in northern Italy called the Rubicon. Today it is unremarkable. A modest stream, roughly 20 feet wide in most places, running through flat agricultural land between the cities of Cesena and Rimini. You could cross it in a rowboat. You could cross it, in dry months, on horseback without getting your saddle wet. In January of 49 BC, it was the most important river in the world. On one side of the Rubicon lay the Roman province of Cisalpine Gaul, where Julius Caesar had been the legitimate governor for nearly a decade. On the other side lay Italy itself. And the law, ancient and unambiguous, said this: no Roman general could lead an armed force across that river. The Rubicon was not just a boundary between provinces. It was the legal wall between military power and civilian authority, between a governor with his army and a citizen walking unarmed into the city that governed him. Cross it with legions, and you were not a governor or a general or a candidate for office. You were a traitor, an enemy of the state, a man who had declared war on Rome. Caesar knew this. He had always known this. He had spent the previous 2 years trying, through every legal avenue available to him, to find a way to step down from his command without stepping into the trap waiting for him on the other side. The situation had been building since Crassus's death, and then Julia had stripped away the personal bonds of the triumvirate. By 51 BC, the conservative senators who had hated Caesar for a decade sensed their opening. Their strategy was as elegant as it was merciless: force Caesar to relinquish his army before he could stand for the consulship again, then prosecute him as a private citizen. For what offenses? There were plenty to choose from, real and invented. The point was not the charges. The point was that a private citizen with no legions had no leverage, and a man with no leverage in Roman politics in 50 BC was a dead man in one sense or another. Caesar attempted compromise after compromise. He proposed that both he and Pompey simultaneously disband their armies. He offered to surrender all but 2 legions if he could keep his command through the elections. He sent letter after letter to the Senate, each one more conciliatory in tone than the last, each one rejected. On the 7th of January, 49 BC, the Senate passed its final decree: Caesar was to lay down his command at once. If he refused, he would be declared an enemy of the Republic. The tribunes Marcus Antonius and Quintus Cassius Longinus, who had been representing Caesar's interests in Rome, were physically driven out of the Senate chamber when they tried to exercise their veto. They fled to Caesar's camp in Gaul dressed as slaves, because it was the only way they could travel safely. Caesar had his answer. He was in Ravenna, the city at the southern edge of his province, when the Senate's decree reached him. He held a dinner party. Suetonius tells us this with the specificity that makes it somehow more disturbing than anything else. Caesar hosted his guests that evening with apparent serenity. Examined some architectural drawings that had been brought to him, discussed them at length, and gave no outward sign of the decision he had already made. He let his guests retire. Then he rose, found a small group of close companions, and rode south through the winter night. He reached the Rubicon in the hours before dawn. What happened at that riverbank has been recorded by Plutarch, Suetonius, and Appian, and the 3 accounts share the same essential architecture even when they disagree on the details. Caesar paused. He stood at the water and, according to every source, he weighed what he was about to do. He spoke of the magnitude of it. He spoke of the consequences. The man who had never hesitated in front of a Gallic shield wall stood at a shallow river in northern Italy, and felt the weight of an entire civilization pressing down on the moment. Plutarch records that Caesar spoke to the men around him of the suffering that crossing would bring, not just to himself but to everyone. He looked at the river for a long time. Then, in the account Plutarch preserves, a figure appeared on the riverbank. A man of extraordinary height and beauty, seated there playing a reed pipe. Some of Caesar's soldiers had gathered to listen. The figure rose, snatched a trumpet from one of them, sounded the military advance with enormous force, and walked across the river. Caesar, according to Suetonius, then turned to those nearest him and said, in the Latin that history has handed down to us, "The die is cast." What Caesar actually said at the Rubicon cannot be known with certainty. Plutarch records the phrase in Greek, not Latin, as a line from the playwright Menander, "Let the die be cast." The difference in tense between the two versions matters more than it might appear. Suetonius's Latin says the die has been cast, that something is already done, that the choice is behind him. Plutarch's Greek says let it be cast, an imperative, an active will still in progress. One version is a man announcing a fait accompli. The other is a man commanding himself forward. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps neither is. What is certain is that Julius Caesar, in the early hours of January 10 or 11, 49 BC, led his soldiers across the Rubicon River. The 13th Legion, veterans of 9 years in Gaul, crossed in the darkness and marched south. Within hours, Caesar had taken the city of Ariminum, modern Rimini, without resistance. He sent the tribune Marcus Antonius ahead with 5 cohorts. He himself followed with another 5. The towns along the road opened their gates before he arrived. Nobody wanted to fight Caesar's Gallic veterans. Nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of what was clearly coming. The news arrived in Rome like a stone thrown through a window. Pompey had told the Senate, some months earlier, that he could deal with Caesar. He had said, with the confidence of a man who had spent 40 years being the most militarily significant person in any room, that he had only to stamp his foot on Italian soil, and legions would spring up to follow him. The senators had believed him because they needed to believe him. After all, the alternative was too frightening. Now the senators discovered what stamping one's foot actually produces when done by a man whose veterans are marching south from the Rubicon. The reaction was not a battle. It was a rout. Pompey and both consuls fled Rome. They headed south, toward Brundisium, toward the sea, toward Greece, where Pompey's prestige in the east could be converted back into an army. Most of the Senate followed. They left in such haste that the treasury was not emptied. They left Rome, the capital of the Republic, the city that had governed the world for 5 centuries, without a fight. Caesar entered Rome on approximately the 1st of March, 49 BC. The treasury was locked. A tribune named Lucius Caecilius Metellus stood in front of it with a veto. Caesar, according to Plutarch, told Metellus that it was harder for him to say this than to do it, and then threatened to kill him. Metellus stepped aside. Caesar took the money he needed and moved on. Everything he did in those first days was calculated. He issued proclamations of clemency. He released prisoners. He allowed Pompey's supporters who had not fled to remain in their homes. He was not the tyrant the Senate had spent a decade warning Rome about. He was the wronged man, the loyal general who had served the Republic faithfully for 9 years, driven to extreme measures by the illegal attacks of jealous enemies. Whether he believed any of this himself, we do not know. What we know is that it worked. The towns that had not opened their gates before he arrived began opening them voluntarily. The soldiers he captured were offered the choice of joining him or going home. Almost none went home. He was building a story about himself in real time, and the story was more powerful than any battle. Pompey, watching from across the Adriatic, understood this. He had always understood the importance of reputation in Roman politics. But he had never quite mastered the way Caesar used it, the way Caesar could transform a legal argument into a moral drama, with himself always in the role of the man who had no choice. He set about doing what he knew how to do, building an army. He had the East, and the East had everything. Money, men, grain, client kings who owed him debts that spanned decades. He would gather it all, cross back to Greece with overwhelming force, and face Caesar on his own terms. It was a sound plan. It was, in a different world, the plan of a man who would win. But it rested on one assumption that was about to prove false: that Caesar would give him the time he needed. Pompey's strategy, at its core, was patience. He had seen impatient men destroy themselves before. He had seen generals overextend, politicians overreach, allies collapse because they had bet everything on a single throw. Pompey the Great had not become Pompey the Great by being reckless. He had become who he was by being methodical, systematic, and almost impossibly difficult to surprise. So he crossed the Adriatic to Greece in March of 49 BC with the 2 legions he had at Brundisium, and he began to build. His reputation in the East was extraordinary. He had campaigned there in the 60s BC, reorganized the entire region, created new provinces, and settled disputes between kingdoms that had been festering for generations. The client kings remembered. The governors remembered. The money began to flow. By early 48 BC, he had assembled an army in Thessaloniki and at his main camp in northern Greece, numbering somewhere between 45,000 and 60,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Supported by grain shipments from Egypt and the financial resources of half the eastern Mediterranean. He also had the legitimate government of Rome. Both consuls were with him. Most of the Senate was with him. The official decrees, the formal authority of the Republic that had governed the world since the founding of the city, all of it sat in Pompey's camp on the plains of Greece rather than in Rome. By every legal and constitutional measure available, Pompey was the defender of the state, and Caesar was the criminal who had seized it by force. On paper, Pompey had already won. What Pompey did not do, and could not do, was stop Caesar from moving. Caesar understood, with the instinctive certainty of a man who had spent a decade fighting Gallic tribes that never quite stayed beaten, that time was his enemy. Every week he gave Pompey was another week of resources, another week of men trained, another week of the story shifting away from the wounded hero forced to act and toward the usurper clinging to what he had taken. He needed to keep moving. He needed to deny Pompey the one thing Pompey needed most. Rather than immediately crossing the Adriatic to chase Pompey, Caesar turned west. This decision baffled some of his officers and all of his enemies. Spain. 7 veteran Pompeian legions under the command of Lucius Afranius and Marcus Petreius. If Caesar crossed to Greece with those legions at his back, he could find himself caught between 2 armies. He reportedly told those around him, before he left, "I go to fight an army without a general. Then I will fight a general without an army." The Spanish campaign of 49 BC is not the campaign that history remembers best, because it contains no single dramatic battle, no famous quote, no moment that myth can attach itself to. What it contains, instead, is a demonstration of what Caesar was actually better at than almost anyone who had ever commanded a Roman army. The ability to win without fighting when winning without fighting was possible. He moved his forces into Spain at extraordinary speed, covering ground that Pompey's commanders had expected would take months in a matter of weeks. He did not attack the Pompeian legions head-on. He maneuvered, cut supply lines, flooded the land with engineering projects that reversed the natural flow of logistics. and by July of 49 BC had forced Afranius and Petreius into a position from which they could not escape without either fighting at severe disadvantage or surrendering. They surrendered. Caesar discharged the soldiers, offered the officers amnesty, and turned around. The whole operation, from the crossing of the Pyrenees to the surrender of the last Pompeian force, had taken roughly 40 days. His clemency in Spain was not merely magnanimous. It was strategic genius. Every soldier he released rather than killed was a man who would go home and tell his neighbors that Caesar had let him live. Every officer he pardoned rather than executed was a man with influence and a story to tell about Caesar's mercy. He was building his narrative as methodically as he built his camps, one story at a time, one released prisoner at a time, across the entire span of the Roman world. He returned to Rome briefly, then crossed the Adriatic in January of 48 BC, in winter, which military convention at the time considered a reckless if not insane thing to do. Winter crossings of the Adriatic were genuinely dangerous. Ships were lost. Men drowned. Caesar crossed anyway, because the alternative was giving Pompey the spring to continue building his strength. He landed in Epirus with 7 legions, approximately 15,000 to 20,000 men, far less than the force facing him across the plains of northern Greece. He sent his ships back for the rest, who were stuck in Brundisium waiting for favorable winds. For weeks, Caesar was in enemy territory with less than half his army, cut off from reinforcement by sea, dependent on foraging for supplies in a hostile country. And then the two armies found each other, and what followed was not the decisive battle anyone had expected. It was a siege. Caesar attempted to seal off Pompey's larger force at Dyrrhachium, modern Durrës on the Albanian coast, by constructing an extraordinary line of fortifications. Stretching nearly 15 miles, that circled Pompey's camp and cut him off from the interior. It was an audacious engineering project, the kind of thing that Caesar's men had come to expect from him, the conversion of sheer labor and tactical imagination into military advantage. Pompey's response was to build his own parallel fortification line, and for months in the spring and early summer of 48 BC. The two armies looked at each other across a no-man's land of earthworks and camps, probing, skirmishing, neither side quite ready for the collision that everyone knew was coming. It came in July. 2 Gallic officers in Caesar's camp, men who had been caught embezzling pay from their soldiers and faced punishment, defected to Pompey and gave him detailed intelligence about the weaknesses in Caesar's siege lines. Pompey attacked at exactly the right point, at exactly the right time. Caesar's lines were breached. His forces were thrown into confusion. 3,000 of his soldiers were killed in a matter of hours and, according to Suetonius, Caesar himself rode into the chaos to rally his retreating men and came within moments of being overwhelmed. It was the closest Caesar came to total defeat in the entire war. He himself later admitted it. He said, according to Plutarch, that the enemy would have won the war that day if they had had a general who knew how to use a victory. Pompey's generals urged immediate pursuit. They had Caesar's veterans running. Chase them. Finish it now. End the war on this hill, today, before Caesar can regroup. Pompey hesitated. He was a deliberate man. He had always been a deliberate man. Rashness had never been among his vices, and against lesser opponents that careful patience had served him magnificently. He wanted to consolidate his gains, resupply his forces, and make certain that whatever came next was not a reversal of the reversal. He had spent 40 years winning by not making mistakes. Caesar used the time Pompey gave him to retreat south, regroup his scattered forces, feed his hungry soldiers, and give his veterans what he had always given them in difficult moments himself. He moved through his camp at night, according to the accounts, talking to his soldiers in the personal way that great commanders sometimes have. And lesser ones can only imitate. He knew their names. He knew their histories. He knew which centurion had taken an arrow at the Sambra River in 57 BC and which one had been the first man over the wall at Alesia. These men were not an army to Caesar. They were his instrument, carefully built over 9 years, and he needed them to believe, one more time, that what had just happened was not the end. They believed him. That was always the extraordinary thing about Caesar's men. They believed him. In August of 48 BC, both armies began moving south through Thessaly, toward a wide plain near a city called Pharsalus. The decisive moment that everything had been moving toward since a young woman had died in childbirth 4 years earlier. Since the richest man in the world had ridden into a desert to die, since a man had stood at a river at midnight and decided that some things were worth more than safety, was now approximately 3 days' march away. On both sides, men sharpened their swords and tried to sleep. August 9, 48 BC. The plains of Thessaly, central Greece. The sun rises over the valley of the Enipeus River. It hits a flat, wide plain between 2 fortified camps, and the men on both sides of that plain know, with the particular certainty that soldiers develop about these things, that today is the day. They have been at this for months. The marching, the maneuvering, the failed sieges, the narrow escapes, and the supply lines stretched thin across half the Mediterranean. The soldiers on both sides are Romans, trained in the same tradition, speaking the same language, many of them veterans of the same campaigns. Some of them have friends, brothers, and cousins on the other side. The Civil War has a specific horror that foreign wars do. Not everyone involved understands exactly what the other side is capable of, because they learned it from the same teachers. On the northern side of the plain, Pompey the Great surveys the army he has spent the better part of 2 years building from the resources of the Eastern world. His numbers are staggering. 45,000 infantry, organized into 110 cohorts. 7,000 cavalry, archers, slingers, auxiliary forces from a dozen client kingdoms. The legitimate Senate of Rome, or what remains of it, is watching from his camp. Both consuls of the Republic are with him. The Roman state, in every legal and constitutional sense, is on Pompey's side of that plain. On the southern side, Julius Caesar looks at what he has. 22,000 infantry. 1,000 cavalry. His 8 legions are understrength, depleted by the losses at Dyrrhachium and the months of hard campaigning that followed. Some of his cohorts have barely 1,000 men each. His supply situation has been precarious for weeks. He has been foraging for food across Thessaly while Pompey's camp receives Egyptian grain by the shipload. By any reasonable military calculus, what is about to happen should not happen. A veteran army of 22,000 men does not defeat an army of 45,000 entrenched in a favorable position with overwhelming cavalry superiority. This is not how battles work. This is not how wars work. Almost everyone looking at those 2 camps from the outside, including most of Pompey's generals, believes that the result is not really in question. The only disagreement is over timing. Caesar knows something they do not. He knows Pompey. He has watched Pompey operate for 20 years. He understands the way Pompey thinks, the virtues that make him great, and the habits that make him predictable. Pompey is methodical. Pompey relies on numerical superiority. Pompey, when he has the advantage, waits for his advantage to become overwhelming before he moves. And in the previous day's reconnaissance, Caesar had seen something in the deployment of Pompey's forces that told him exactly what Pompey planned to do with his greatest advantage, the cavalry. 7,000 horsemen against 1,000. On the open plain of Thessaly, that ratio would normally be decisive. Pompey intends to mass his cavalry on his left wing, sweep around Caesar's right flank, envelop the entire Caesarian army from behind, and collapse it like a closing fist. It is a textbook maneuver, correctly executed, and it will work against any conventional Roman deployment. Caesar makes an unconventional one. The night before the battle, he calls his officers together and gives his orders. From each of his legions, one cohort is to be detached from the third line and formed into a separate fourth line, positioned obliquely behind his right wing. Hidden from Pompey's view by the angle of the deployment. 3,000 to 4,000 men, drawn from veterans who understand exactly what they are being asked to do and why. Their orders are specific. They are to hold position until Pompey's cavalry has committed to the flanking attack, then move to intercept at the moment of maximum vulnerability. And when they close with the horsemen, Caesar gives them one more instruction that Plutarch preserves in his Life of Caesar. They are to aim their javelins not at the bodies of the cavalry but at their faces. Caesar explains his reasoning. Pompey's horsemen are young men of aristocratic families, unused to disfigurement, proud of their appearance. Unaccustomed to the particular horror of a facial wound. Strike them there, and they will flinch. Flinch, and the charge will waver. Waver, and the whole momentum of 7,000 horses becomes 7,000 individual animals with frightened riders. It is a small psychological insight. On the morning of August the 9th, 48 years before the birth of Christ, it was the Battle of Pharsalus. The armies marched toward each other at mid-morning. Caesar's men, in his own account, cover most of the distance at a controlled pace, then pause to rest before the final charge. A discipline that speaks to exactly how well trained his veterans have become over 9 years together. They know not to arrive at the shield wall winded. They have done this before. The infantry lines crash together. Both sides hold. Pompey has deployed his cohorts 10 men deep, unusually thick, designed to absorb the impact of Caesar's charge rather than meet it with momentum of its own. It works, for a time. The fighting is brutal and close, and neither line moves. Then Labienus, commanding Pompey's cavalry on the left wing, gives the order to advance. 7,000 horsemen sweep forward. Caesar's 1,000 cavalry fights and gives ground and fights again, exactly as planned. The Pompeian horse presses forward, beginning to file off in the flanking movement that will end the battle. And then Caesar signals the fourth line. 3,000 to 4,000 veterans, who have been standing at an oblique angle behind the cavalry engagement, advance at the run. The Pompeian horsemen are already committed to the turning movement, their momentum forward and sideward, when the infantry hits them from an unexpected direction. The javelins rise. Caesar's account records the result with the clean brevity of a man who has watched battles for 2 decades. Not a man of the cavalry stood. They wheeled about, not merely quitting their post but galloping in disorder toward the mountains in the distance. The archers and slingers who had been supporting the cavalry, now exposed, are cut down. Pompey's left flank is open. Caesar commits his fresh third line to the infantry battle at exactly this moment. Fresh men crashing into an enemy center that has been fighting for an hour and is now watching its entire left wing collapse into the hills. Pompey's army does not break slowly. It breaks all at once, the way a wall breaks when the foundation goes. Everything that seemed solid becomes nothing suddenly. From his position at the left wing, Pompey watches it happen. Plutarch records the moment with a precision that feels almost too painful to read. When Pompey saw his cavalry routed and scattered, he was no longer himself. He said nothing. He rode back to his camp. He went into his tent. He sat down. He said not a word to anyone. Then, after some time, he removed his general's armor and put on the plain clothing of a private citizen. The man who had commanded the largest Roman army ever fielded in a single engagement, who had built it from nothing over 2 years. Through sheer force of reputation and organizational genius. Who had staked the future of the Roman Republic on a single morning on the plains of Thessaly, simply got up and walked out the back of his camp. Caesar, riding through the chaos of his own victory, pauses at the entrance to the Pompeian camp and looks at the tables set for a celebration that will never happen. Pompey's officers had apparently been so confident of victory that they had ordered the camp decorated in preparation for a triumph. Flowers, laurel, freshly cleaned silver plate. The material certainty of men who believed the outcome was never really in doubt. Caesar reportedly says, quietly, that these men brought this on themselves. Then he orders his legions not to stop. Not to rest, not to plunder, not to celebrate. The army that has just won the most important battle of the Civil War is going to keep moving, because Caesar does not win a battle and then let the consequences escape. The pursuit continues through the Thessalian heat for the rest of the day and into the night. Pompey is already gone. He rides to the coast, takes a ship, and begins the last journey of his life, moving east through the Aegean toward whatever future he can still find. His army, minus the dead and captured, scatters to the winds. Some will fight on under his sons for years to come. Most will not. Caesar's own casualty report, recorded in his civil war, says 200 soldiers killed, 30 centurions. The numbers are almost certainly minimized, as Caesar's own accounting of his losses generally was, but the disproportion is real. He has destroyed the largest army raised against him in a single engagement and lost a fraction of what any general would consider acceptable. 24,000 Pompeian prisoners are brought before him. Caesar walks down the line of men who had been trying to kill him that morning and offers them the choice. Join him or go home. Almost none go home. There is nowhere left to go. The Civil War is not over. It will grind on for 4 more years, through Africa and Spain, as Pompey's sons and the last of the Senate conservatives refuse to accept what Pharsalus has decided. Cato the Younger, the most uncompromising defender of the Republic, will commit suicide in Utica rather than live under Caesar's rule. He will do it by stabbing himself in the stomach and, when his friends find him, an attempt to bind the wound. Opening it again with his own hands, because Cato would rather die twice than owe his life to a man he considers a tyrant. But the outcome of the Civil War was decided on August 9, 48 BC, on a flat plain in Thessaly, before the sun had reached the middle of the sky. Everything else is aftermath. There is a building in Rome, in the neighborhood the city still calls Largo di Torre Argentina, where cats sleep among ancient stones in the afternoon sun. Tourists photograph them. Locals walk past without looking. The ruins are so old that the city has simply incorporated them into the landscape, the way a river incorporates whatever falls into it. Those stones are what remain of the theater of Pompey. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, 3 years and 7 months after the plains of Pharsalus, Julius Caesar walked into a meeting room attached to that theater. Sat down in a golden chair at the foot of a marble statue of Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, and was stabbed 23 times by 60 senators who had decided, collectively, that the man who had ended the Civil War had become more dangerous than the Civil War itself. The details about the statue are not a legend. Plutarch records it. It is corroborated by Suetonius and Appian, and its location is confirmed by excavations in 2012. Caesar did not die in the Roman Forum or on the steps of the Capitol, as centuries of paintings and one very famous Shakespeare play would lead you to believe. He died at the base of the statue of the man he had defeated at Pharsalus, in a building that bore that man's name, because the Forum's Senate house had been burned down in riots years earlier, and this was where the Senate met instead. History does not always arrange its ironies so neatly. This time, it did. We have traveled a long distance to arrive back here. We began with a head in a box on an Egyptian beach, and now we stand in a Roman meeting room 3 years later, watching the man who received that head die at the foot of his old partner's statue. The circle is complete, and it is the kind of circle that makes you sit quietly for a moment after it closes. Go back to the beginning of this story, to the Rome of 60 BC, and try to see it with fresh eyes, two extraordinary men who needed each other. One alliance built on genuine mutual benefit and, for a few years at least, a genuine human connection. A young woman whose marriage held the thing together, not just politically but humanly, because she loved her husband and he loved her back. And that love was a thread of something real running through all the calculation and ambition. Then the thread broke, and everything the thread was holding broke with it. We tell stories about Caesar and Pompey as if it were inevitable, as if two men that ambitious and that powerful were always going to end up destroying each other. As if the outcome was written somewhere like things before either of them was born. Maybe that is true. Maybe in a world with one throne and two men capable of sitting on it, the math was always going to resolve itself this way. But consider the other version. The version in which Crassus does not ride into the Parthian desert chasing a triumph he did not need. The version in which Julia does not die in childbirth at 20-something years old. The version in which the conservative senators in Rome are pragmatic enough to grant Caesar the small legal accommodation he is asking for, rather than forcing a confrontation that burns everything down. In that version, there is no Rubicon crossing. There is no civil war. There is no Pharsalus. There is no head in a box. There is no golden chair at the foot of a marble statue. In that version, the Republic survives, or at least gets more time. But that is not the version we have. We have this one Pompey, dying with his face covered in a rowboat off the Egyptian coast, refusing to let his killers see his expression. Caesar, turning away from the wrapped gift that the Egyptians bring him, reaching for a ring, and weeping, or performing. Weeping, or doing both at once in the way that very calculating men sometimes cannot separate the performance from the grief. Caesar himself, 3 years later, sank against the pedestal of Pompey's statue with 23 wounds. Pulling his own toga over his face the way Pompey had done, because some gestures contain everything a man has no words left to say. He kept Pompey's ring, you know, right up until the end. No ancient source tells us why. He never wrote about it, never spoke about it within earshot of anyone who recorded the conversation. But the ring stayed with him through Egypt and Africa and Spain. Through the dictatorship and the reorganization of the Roman calendar and the building projects and the trials and the honors and the growing whispers about kingship and the Senate's gathering fear. We can only imagine what he felt when he looked at it, whether it was grief, or guilt, or something colder and more complicated than either. Whether it was a reminder of what ambition costs when two men have too much of it and not enough world to share. Whether it was simply a habit, the way we all keep objects that connect us to things we cannot quite explain. We know that Rome was never the same after Pharsalus. The republic that had governed the Western world for nearly 5 centuries. Outlasted the battle by only 4 years, and it outlasted them only technically. Caesar became dictator in perpetuity in February of 44 BC. The Senate gave him a golden chair. It voted him semi-divine honors. It did everything except call him a king, and then it killed him in a room named after the man he had beaten. The men who killed him believed they were saving the Republic. They were not. The Republic was already gone. Pharsalus had killed it, quietly, on a Tuesday morning in August in a Greek valley most of them had never heard of. What the conspirators killed on the Ides of March was the symbol of the thing that had killed it. The empire that followed, the principate that Augustus would build from the wreckage of the next 13 years of civil war, was in many ways a more stable and equitable system than the late Republic had been. It lasted, in one form or another, for 5 centuries in the West and 15 centuries in the East. Many historians argue that the transformation was inevitable. A city-state's constitution simply cannot hold together an empire of that size, and something had to give. They are probably right. But right and good are not the same thing. And the world that emerged from the ruins of the Republic was built on the wreckage of something that had, for all its corruption and violence and dysfunction, contained within it a genuine idea that no one man should hold absolute power, that the law stood above any individual, that the state belonged to its citizens rather than to whoever was strong enough to take it. Caesar and Pompey both believed in that idea, in their way, and both violated it, in their way. Both died without ever quite understanding that you cannot preserve a republic by being willing to start a civil war to protect your personal dignity within it. The die was cast. The river was crossed. And on the other side of that river, Rome was waiting. Changed forever, in ways that neither man intended and both men made inevitable. Pompey died in a rowboat. Caesar died at his statue's feet. The Republic died somewhere between the two. And the cats sleep in the ruins of his theater, in the afternoon sun, and the tourists photograph them, and the stones hold everything that is left.